Hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining yet another lecture, the Inspiration Lecture Series. Today we have with us Professor Alex Whalley from University of Calgary. And Professor Whalley will be talking about the topic universities and regional growth. Professor Alexander Whalley is an associate professor of economics at the University of Calgary and a lab economist with the Creative Destruction Lab Rockies. His research has examined how university technology affects regional growth, urban transit impacts, air quality, and the effects of accountability structures on government performance. Professor Whalley has received financial support from the National Science Foundation, Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and the National Bureau of Economic Research for his research. Dr. Whalley has received his undergraduate degree from the University of Western Ontario. He has earned his MA in economics from the University of British Columbia, and he has completed his doctorate in economics from the University of Maryland, College Park. And with that, I will hand it over to Professor Whalley for the lecture. Before that, I would request everyone to please make sure that your microphone is muted at all times. Your webcam is switched off at all times. If you have any question, please type in your question in the chat box, and Professor Whalley will answer the question, either during the lecture or at the end of the lecture. So with that, Professor Whalley, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here. It's really a pleasure to be coming to you guys and talking to you about some work that I've been doing. It's great to have a chance to talk about this. So universities and regional growth is the topic. It's an area I've been interested in for quite some time. We have a lot of discussions about, what generates regional growth, how do different local economies or regional economies, how do they power their growth? What can policymakers do? Should they be thinking about universities as a source of growth? Or do universities just kind of come along for the ride? An area that's successful is able to fund and develop a lot of universities as well. So the image I have here is kind of a typical United States campus. It's a very bucolic environment, very pastoral, kind of relaxed environment. This is really the traditional way we think about universities. We think about universities as a place of learning, a place of, people would think a lot about libraries and reading different kinds of information, being taught by experts in a certain topic, very specialized knowledge. And historically, the universities that we have in the West have really come from a religious background. Really, the goal of universities was really a religious training, was really where they started. And then they've expanded their mission quite a bit since then. So if you look at the United States, a lot of the most famous private universities, they were founded as theological seminaries. They were training different priests for different religions. And so part of the reason there's so many in the United States is they were all training different religions, basically. And so there's quite a few, and they're all non-denominational. They've become non-denominational now. So religion is much less important part of their mission today. And the missions changed quite a bit. So in the late 1800s in the United States, so in 1876, Johns Hopkins University was founded, and that was the first real United States kind of research university. And at the same time, there was a large public investment. So after the Civil War in the United States, so after the 1860s, there was the founding of the land-grant universities. And those are basically the famous state universities in each state. So you could think about the University of Maryland would be one, the University of Iowa would be another. And they were founded with a new kind of mission. It was a little different from what universities had been before. Before that time period, universities had been almost like high schools. So they're much more focused on being a college and less focused on research. And the land-grant universities were focused on research, but they were focused on research in a very applied way. So one of their missions was really to improve agriculture in these different states and also to improve agricultural productivity. And when it first started, they were looking to the German universities. German universities really were the leaders this time period. They were the leading research universities, and a lot of the faculty were trained in Germany, but the German model was much more basic. And so they brought these faculty in, and they said, look, we like the knowledge base you have, we like the research you're doing, but we want you to be a lot more applied. And that's really where the kind of modern American research university came from. And then if we look forward to today, the role of the university is definitely shifting. So we're moving away from universities being solely about just discovery or solely about just training students. A lot of governments, a lot of policymakers, a lot of stakeholders are looking for universities to do something more. They're looking for universities to be really a source of growth. Can universities help power our economy? So what I want to talk about today is that really a realistic expectation? Can we ask that of universities? What's the evidence, and how do we think about these questions? So as you know, Jindal Global University is a great example of a recent university that started up and having fantastic success. And you know, it's been amazing, the transformation that's happened to the campus just in such a short time period. And you know, one of the questions people might ask is this really going to transform this region? The university is not too far from Delhi, but a little bit outside of Delhi. And from what I understand, the area is pretty rural and pretty agricultural. It's not really a tech center at this stage. And so, you know, one of the questions you might ask is, will this university be a catalyst to transform this region? And you know, it is a private university, but most universities do get funding from the government in some sense. A lot of research funding specifically is typically funded by the government. Research funding in most countries is typically funded by federal governments, so the national government, not really by local governments. And those governments are asking more and more of universities and the whole ecosystem. What's the benefit we're getting? You know, how is this really developing our economies, and is it having, you know, broader effects on the economy? Is it only concentrated amongst those people who, you know, maybe are on campus, students or faculty, or does it have broader effects? Is it generating startups? Are other companies off campus, you know, learning about new technologies through different programs to sort of get the knowledge off campus and things like that? So my background, my approach to sort of coming to this question was starting my career in the United States. So I was a professor at the University of California, Merced. You probably haven't heard of it, but it's really the way the university talks about itself is the first research university of the 21st century. So it was founded in 2005, so a couple years before Jindal was founded. And it's part of the University of California system. So the most famous universities are universities like UC Berkeley or UCLA, but it's a system of universities. And the idea is all the universities are research intensive. So California has two tiers of universities. These are kind of the eminent universities in California. And the California state campuses are much less focused on research, much more focused on training. And a lot of the rhetoric around the campus, or a lot of the reasons it was put there, is this is actually a fairly impoverished region of California. This is not like Silicon Valley. And so it's not that far away. You can see on the map there. It's only, you know, maybe 100 miles away from Silicon Valley, which would be sort of around here. UC Merced is here. But the area it was put in is quite agricultural, quite rural. It has a lot of issues of poverty. So there's a high amount of poverty among the population. It's generally less educated. And so part of the reason of putting it in this region was to see, you know, maybe we can use this university as a tool to improve the local economy. And I was there at that time period, and I was curious about the question: is this something that's actually there's evidence for this or not? And I started reading the research a little more, and it really seemed that the evidence base wasn't there. So it's definitely true that, you know, there's some correlational relationships between, you know, where universities are located and what the local economy is doing. But the question of causality is really central here. You know, is it really the university that's causing an area to be successful, or is it a successful area can fund a university and can put the resources in, you know, needed to develop a really strong university? So that's kind of my origin to the question. And the university has expanded quite a bit. So when I first arrived, it was 2006. You know, second year of university, there was 1,200 students at the university at that time. Now it's about 10,000 students. So now it's kind of a full-blown campus. And so there has been already some studies actually trying to measure, you know, what the impact of this campus opening actually was. And so the model people have in their mind is really Stanford and Silicon Valley, right? We've had this idea that, you know, the research universities really power local economies, and this kind of the shining example is Silicon Valley, and a lot of areas around the world would love to be as successful as Silicon Valley. And so look to Stanford and say, you know, is that an example of what we should do? Should we really be investing a lot of our resources in kind of a world-class research university, and they have this idea in their head? And if you actually go to Stanford and you talk to some of the faculty there, what they talk about is there's people from all over the world that come to Stanford, they come to Silicon Valley, and they kind of meet with the faculty during the day. They have a nice visit to the campus. And then after they go out for dinner, and they sort of get the faculty member and the other people by themselves, they sort of say, okay, can you tell us the secret? You know, what's the secret? How did you guys do this? And so there's a tremendous amount of interest. But at the same time, you know, Stanford is powering Silicon Valley. We see other areas in the United States that have world-class leading universities that are not very developed. So the area outside is not a tech center. So for example, Yale is a world-class research university, but New Haven, Connecticut, where it's located, does not have a big tech cluster. Same thing in Chicago. So Chicago has University of Chicago, Northwestern, both world-class research universities, but there's not really a really large successful tech cluster there. So we have to, when we have this example in our mind, we have to think about, is this really best practices we can think about trying to adopt in other places, or is this just kind of an outlier? We shouldn't pay too much attention to it. One thing we have to keep in our mind is that, you know, world-class research universities are very expensive. It's not a cheap operation to run. It requires a lot of resources. So in the example of University of California, Merced, it's great for the local economy in part just because it transfers resources in. So the local taxpayers in that small town, they're not really paying for the university. It's really the whole state that's paying for the university. So it's kind of, you know, it would be very, very hard for any government to say, okay, every impoverished area, we're just going to build a research university. It may not be even, you know, possible to do that. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And the reason people think about this is really the income of people in an area is highly correlated with being a knowledge hub. So what's become increasingly true is that being connected to a knowledge hub is very important for your income. And it certainly is if you're in a tech sector job, and we see these tech sector jobs are very highly clustered in certain locations. But even workers who are outside of those clusters, you know, if you're working in like a service type job, so if you're working in a restaurant, you know, you can probably have charge more for your food. You can offer higher quality food that you could potentially make more money off of if you have a lot of you know, other high income people in your area. So this is data from the United States, and it just shows this upward relationship with the area, the percentage of adults with a university degree. When you have a small number of adults with a university degree down here, the income in the other sectors and the non-education sector tends to be lower. But when you have a larger number, it tends to be higher. And so there's well-known, and there's been a lot of work on what's called human capital externalities. So human capital externalities, the idea is that just being around a lot of knowledgeable people, it makes you more productive. You learn things you wouldn't have learned otherwise. So when you're in an area with lots of highly educated people, you can learn about new technologies more quickly. You can learn about new ideas you didn't think about. You can develop new innovations you hadn't been exposed to. And it's not really just your own human capital, your own knowledge base you're drawing on. It's really the knowledge base of your whole community. And so that's part of what gives rise to this idea that, you know, universities might be pretty important because they produce this kind of knowledge and they produce this kind of skill. And so there's been a lot of interest in that question. And if you go back in time historically, you know, Stanford used to be called the farm. That's how they thought about it. And I imagine it's similar to how people think about OP Jindal right now. Stanford was in Palo Alto, which is in what is now Silicon Valley, but at the time it was a fruit farm area. People would farm fruit down there, and it was pretty far away from San Francisco, so it would have been kind of pretty disconnected from the main economic driver of the region. And it's been called the farm, and so it started off with this building called the Red Barn. That was really the origins of Stanford, and then people still talk about it as the farm today. And so, you know, if you think this very kind of small scale university, this very early start, is this something that we can think about replicating more broadly? And does this kind of early leadership, this ability to start a university kind of before anybody else did? So Stanford started in 1891. That was an era of universities being founded. A lot of wealthy private sector industrialists wanted to start universities. So Carnegie Mellon, University of Chicago, places like that, where a lot of them were founded in that era. And so is that something we can think about? These universities have much larger, longer term effect, maybe than initially. So maybe on a year-to-year basis, the effects are not as big, but over time, maybe the effects grow. And if we go back to somewhere like UC Merced or maybe Open Jindal, it's a rural area today, but does that mean it can become, you know, a Silicon Valley in the future, sort of built around that university? And that's the idea. There's kind of this idea there's like a first mover advantage. So, you know, we hear a lot in tech, you know, the first mover kind of wins. That's like a really important place to be. So we think about Amazon. You know, Amazon is really the first one to roll out massive retail online. And the fact that they were first enabled them to capture significant market share of that nascent industry. And then over time, they've been able to expand from there. Same thing with Tesla. Tesla, you know, when it first started, I was very skeptical. I really didn't think there was a great business there. Been proven wrong. And they were really the first mover in terms of electric vehicles. They early on understood the technology and how important it could be. They realized that the costs of electric technology were dropping really fast. And so if they could get in first and kind of push really hard and really reduce those costs, they could build a really big company. And so there's a similar idea here that, being early in terms of the knowledge creation or being a knowledge hub early, it kind of has this persistent effect, and it potentially even grows over time. There's a famous saying by the Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and he said that if you want to build a great city, build a great university and wait 100 years. And so that's kind of the idea here. And there is some evidence of that in the United States data. So if we look at the percentage of adults down here with a university degree in 1980, so 30 years ago, we see that areas that had a larger number of university graduates in a long time period ago, 30 years ago, they get a larger change. They're drawing more skilled. So it's like the skilled workers are going to the regions that already have a lot of skill. So it's a story of the rich getting richer in terms of locations and the poor getting poorer. So is this something we really need to think about, or is this another artifact of the data? And so the big questions we're going to answer today that we're interested in is, do research universities really power regional economies? And then, coming out of that is a question for governments. Should governments really fund research universities as a development strategy, or should they just focus on research universities doing what universities do? Should they really think universities are great educating students, that's where we should focus our resources just to educate students, or universities are great at basic research, to do basic research, we should focus on universities? Or should we think about them in a broader way, where universities really can be where we want to allocate resources? So instead of investing in roads, or instead of investing in schools at a lower level, we want to invest in universities. How do we think about that question? And then what do we learn from the Stanford Silicon Valley nexus? It's obviously an important relationship, but is it generalizable? Can we use that as a kind of best practice as an example? Or should we just say, that's a one-off outlier, we shouldn't really build our strategy around that idea? And so when we think about research universities, how do they fit into this framework? Well, they produce really two key outputs. So they produce skilled graduates and scientific discoveries. Those both seem like very important elements. We're talking about knowledge hubs, how knowledge hubs can power our regional growth. And so isn't that enough? So you produce skilled graduates or you produce scientific discoveries, maybe it's just obvious that universities should power our regional growth. I'm going to say it's actually not that obvious. So one of the challenges to understand these questions is that the outputs are very mobile. They don't necessarily stay where you create them. So graduates can move anywhere. I'm sure faculty and students know, you've talked to some great students. They would maybe be interested in staying by the university to get a job, but all the great jobs are somewhere else. They're all in Delhi, or they're all in the United States. And so they're moving to those places. And so even if you produce a lot more of them, and if you produce a lot more of them and they all move somewhere completely different, it may not have much effect on the local economy, because the best opportunities may be elsewhere, and highly skilled workers typically are quite mobile. So we see in the United States, and I think other countries, that the mobility of individuals is strongly correlated with education. So generally the highest educated individuals really face the largest labor market. They tend to think of, at least a country or potentially the world as their job opportunities. Whereas less educated workers maybe think about their hometown or their local location as where they might look for jobs. They're less likely to move to a completely different city to look for jobs. So graduates can move anywhere. And so that's one of the reasons why if a university pumps out a ton more great students, it may not have an effect locally because they just leave. Another possibility is the other output produced by universities, discoveries. So they can move anywhere as well, because they can be commercialized somewhere totally different. So for example, in the United States, Boston is typically known as the biotech hub in the country. So if you have a university like the University of Minnesota, which is in Minneapolis, kind of the Midwest part of the United States, they may have a great researcher producing fantastic ideas that could be commercialized into pharmaceutical medication. And maybe that person is producing tons of patents or tons of research papers that have those ideas in them, but they may actually get commercialized in Boston, because that's where the venture capitalists are, and that's where the workers who know how to commercialize technology are. So even if that research lab is spitting off a ton of great papers or patents, it's not really creating jobs in the local economy. So the real big question in this literature, the real big question here is yes, we know universities produce these outputs that should matter, but really, do they stay local, or do they just kind of go everywhere? And we can look at some data on this. So one thing that's really interesting, this is from the CBRE, that's a real estate group in the United States, producing some current data. And they look at brain drain or brain gain in different areas. And so the first one here, the first row is San Francisco Bay Area, which is Silicon Valley. It's like a bigger version of Silicon Valley. And what they calculate is the number of tech degrees that were produced from 2014 to 2018 was about 36,000. But the number of tech jobs was much, much more. So the number of tech jobs was 88,000. And so the brain gain in Silicon Valley is 51,000. So, and it makes sense. If you go to Silicon Valley and you start looking at who's working in those firms, they're not all Stanford graduates. In fact, very, very few are. Stanford is quite a small university. They only admit only around 1,000 students a year. It's quite small. And even Berkeley itself is not that big. So these are well-known universities, but you have students coming from all across the country and even all over the world to work at Silicon Valley. So part of the success of Silicon Valley is not just that the universities there produce a lot of tech grads, it's also they import a lot. Okay, and so that's, I think, a not always understood point. And then other emerging tech places like Toronto, for example, in Canada, Vancouver in Canada, Seattle, Charlotte, they all import tech graduates. They don't just produce them, they bring them from other locations. Okay, so they're having a brain gain. And then some other places are having a brain drain. So, for example, Boston, which has some of the world's best universities, Harvard is in Boston, MIT, Boston University, there's a whole number. It has some of the most biggest concentration of high quality universities in the world. And so they're producing 42,000 tech degrees from 2014 to 2018. And they're only having 10,000 tech jobs added. So, they're actually losing a lot of workers. There's a lot of workers in Boston who are getting a tech degree. They're going somewhere else. Maybe they're going to Silicon Valley, maybe Toronto, maybe Seattle. They're leaving the area. So even though they're producing a ton of tech degrees, they're going somewhere else. And you see a similar pattern from places like Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. again has quite a large number of universities. So they have 52,000 graduates graduating there, and only 23,000 jobs are being created. Chicago, Los Angeles, New York. So these are the world-class cities that are exporting tech jobs. So the mobility of students is really an important thing to think about. And you can see this more broadly, across the United States. There is brain gain and brain drain across different areas. This is showing the number of post-secondary degrees awarded against the change in the bachelor's population. So if everybody stayed where they were educated, all the points should be kind of along this line. It should be a linear line. Right? It should be everyone's just staying where they were educated, but we don't see that very much at all. There's a lot of points kind of off the line. So we see some places like Santa Clara County, which is Silicon Valley. And in there, you see the change in the bachelor's graduates, the change in the highly skilled workers is much bigger than the number of degrees. So we have a hand raised there. I'm not sure if I'm able to access that. Are you able to turn your microphone and ask a question? I'm not sure how this operates. Professor Sand, do you have is there a way to make a question at this point?
I think I saw the hand was raised, but it's been lowered now. So I think that that has been done by mistake. Right.
Okay, for sure. Well, we'll come back to any questions at the end. So please just hold the question. We'd love to hear those questions. So we do see this brain drain or brain gain seems like a pretty important pattern. Not many places are employing the same number of graduates that they're actually producing. Those seem to be quite different numbers. So back to universities. So we do see knowledge hubs are becoming more important. And so universities should have local effects, but university outputs are highly mobile. So maybe university effects are moderate. So that's why we have this question of, what is the role of universities? That's really what generates this question. Because the outputs are mobile, we don't really know what the effects might be. And so if you look at the United States data and you look at locations that have, strong research universities, so this would be those yellow markers there. We see there are some places that do have, high income per capita. So for example, Silicon Valley, you see a lot. Seattle, you see also high income per capita. So it's an area with dark shaded color. But we also see some areas that have, research universities that just don't. They don't seem to be having super high levels of per capita income. So it's not very clear what the results actually are, just looking at the data on a map. If we look at these different locations and we compare locations with a research university, locations without, we can look at the mix of industries and just say how different are these economies. What we see is that areas with a research university tend to be a little more focused, obviously in educational services, but also in finance and insurance. So finance and insurance would be one area that might be closely connected. information technology, they tend to have a larger share there as well, management, and also scientific services. So these economies are different. Where you have a research university, they do different mix of industries. But there's this chicken and egg challenge. Really, the question is, yes, these locations are different, their economies look different, but what do universities really cause to happen in a local economy? And so the challenge is that, what's happening in a local economy also affects the university. So if there's tech companies there that are doing very well, they can provide scholarships, they can provide research funding to the university. They also provide, demand for students. And so maybe the university can get better students. And so the resources flow from the tech community also to the university, not just from the university to the tech community. And so really there's this chicken and egg challenge. What comes first? Is it the chicken, the university, or the egg, tech companies? And that's really the challenge of the research agenda, is to try to figure that out and try to solve that chicken and egg challenge. And what we look at is what we call a natural experiment. So natural experiment is a way to use the data and really think about what we like to do in our mind. The experiment we love to do as economists, as economics researchers, would be to randomly assign universities to different locations. We'd love to just say, the government says, where do you want to put a university? We're gonna build 100 universities, 100 research universities. Where do you want to put them? We'd say, well, don't choose them strategically. Let's just randomly assign them to different locations, and we'll just see what happens. And then we would know, oh, okay, once we randomly assign them, they're not related to any of the economic factors in those locations. We could use that to figure out what the effect of universities was. The problem is no government's going to do that or let us do that. And so we have to try to find a way to approximate that. And so we do is we look for openings of universities, and we use that to try to track what the effects might be. We try to find similar areas that didn't have an opening of the university, where the economy is very, very, very similar. And we say, we're going to use that other place as what we call the counterfactual, what would have happened in that area if the university hadn't been built. And statistically, we look at that difference and we construct the impact of the university from that difference. So basically the question is, does the arrow go this way? Is it Stanford caused Silicon Valley? Is that the direction of causation? Or is it going the other way? Is it Silicon Valley caused Stanford? That's really the question I'm trying to answer. And from a policymaking perspective, we want it to be like this. We want to know if we think it's like this, we can invest in Stanford and we can generate economic growth. If it goes like this, we're going to find out when we invest in Stanford, when we build these research universities, it's not going to have any effect because the university is not actually causing that growth to happen at all. And so, one example of this kind of research agenda, there's a great natural experiment. So natural experiment in this context is the opening of a university. So a university gets opened and we get to track what happens to that economy. And so there was a new research university opened in Korea in 2009. So you got the same year as Jindal. And it's called UNIST, and it's opened in this Ulju County part of Korea in 2019. So right here, the university is opened. It's quite far away from Seoul, quite far away from some of the big cities. And so what we want to understand is what happened in this area, what happened to this area, Ulju County, versus other comparable places after the opening of the university. And then we can use that to understand what the effect of universities might be. So it's really important that we want to use other locations that are similar. So we probably don't want to use Seoul or another location that's very, very different, where the economy is already developed or on a completely different trend. We want to sort of statistically just choose a few of these counties in Korea that might be similar. So you might think about counties that are, maybe on the coast or maybe have a similar economy to Ulju County. And that's really what people would do. And then we think about, okay, what happens after 2009? Do we see this divergence of Ulju County, their economy, from other similar economies that did not have a university? So beforehand, this is the study from Lee in 2020, just coming out in a journal very recently, is that you can see that they construct this, what we call synthetic Ulju. It's a mix of different locations, and they call it synthetic because it's designed to kind of mimic what's happening in Ulju. So before the university opens, the synthetic and the actual really track each other very well. So it seems like the places you think of similar to Ulju are actually very similar because their economies are evolving in a very, very similar way. And then what you can do is think about rolling the clock forward and see what happens. So that's what they do in this kind of analysis. So what you see is that once the university opens, there is this divergence. You do see the number of jobs or the total employment is higher in Ulju, the place that has the university, and not in the place that didn't. But before, really importantly, they track each other very, very closely. So it's really this change, this gap that opens up that allows us to understand what the impact of the university would be on jobs. So there is a positive effect there. We do definitely see that this university did create jobs in this location. And we can also look at different kinds of companies. Some sectors and some companies are very closely connected to a university, and some are not. Some are just completely doing something very different. And so he, in his study, looks at these highly connected sectors. What you see is highly connected sectors. Again, the synthetic group, the sort of created group of similar places, their economy looks pretty similar. The trend in the economy looks pretty similar to old Jew, the place that had the university. But after the university opens, you do see this gap. These highly related sectors, the number of firms does increase. And so we think about this gap here that didn't exist before as the impact of the university. If we look at less related sectors, so sectors that don't have very much to do with the university, we really find not much effect there at all. So really what we see here is, again, it mimics it really well before, but after the university opened, these less related sectors, they might be something like restaurants or low-tech sectors that are not very connected to a university activity. These sectors don't really seem to benefit very much. And so this is what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. So we do know that knowledge hubs are increasingly driving regional growth. It's certainly true in the United States. It's true in many countries. I understand from Professor Sen's work that it's also becoming true in India as well. And we do know that research universities do cause regional growth. So they can be a tool. They can be part of that package. But one thing that's important, cautionary tale, is the role of university output depends a lot on mobility. So it depends much more on the mobility of graduates and ideas. Do discoveries and graduates, do they move around a lot, or do they actually stay localized? It turns out in some of the research I didn't show you today is that research is more locally sticky than graduates. So it turns out that ideas are less mobile than people. The sort of knowledge spillovers or the discoveries that are produced by the university, those are more likely to be commercialized. That doesn't tend to move as far. But graduates do tend to move quite a bit. So they move internationally, they move into different places. That's kind of a puzzle. It's a big puzzle in the literature on urban economics. Why is knowledge not more mobile? So we're in a world where, I can sit in my bedroom and deliver a lecture in India. And, it seems like it's very, very easy to share information across borders and across boundaries. Yet this local contact seems to really matter. There's something about face-to-face interaction that just can't be replicated, and especially for sharing like complex, difficult knowledge, like research discoveries and things like that. And I think we're all noticing that in the COVID reality, where many things are happening remotely and are not happening in person, that there is something lost about being able to interact personally, and this would speak to that. And it's about sharing ideas, and especially complicated, difficult to understand ideas. We think about there's two different kinds of knowledge. There's codified knowledge. So codified knowledge is something you can look up in Google. So you could be like, what's the population of Calgary? You could look that up on Google. You could get a number. That's codified knowledge. That's fairly easy to transmit across borders. The other kind of knowledge is tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is like how to do something. How do you do this kind of research? How do you do this kind of analysis? It's much more difficult to transmit that knowledge across space without personal interaction. You can just think about teaching and learning. If you're explaining to a colleague the kind of research you're doing, how you actually do it, what kind of discoveries you have, and how you actually implement your methodology. It's hard to explain to somebody how they would do the exact same methodology without them being in your office or without you being able to talk to them directly. But so knowledge and knowledge spillover seem to be much more localized. Graduates seem to be more mobile. People can move wherever they like. But that's a bigger question in urban economics. And so I think the development strategy for universities, if you think about how universities are connected to development strategies, it seems like research outputs are really a key part of it, and being connected to the university. So the effects seem quite heterogeneous. It seems like some industries and some firms benefit more than others. And then also research outputs tend to be more localized in students. So I think a lot of development strategies often focus on universities as the producer of graduates only. And they think, and really that's the main way they think about it. And they don't typically think about the mobility of students, people moving from one location to another. But I would argue we need to think about universities in a much broader way, and really also think a lot about the research outputs of the university. So it's been a delight to be here today. Thank you very much for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions or anything you'd like to know more about.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks so much. And we have questions coming. So let me just read out some questions for you. We have one question from Vishav Mehta. When Vishav asks here that I was just curious and wanted to know what is the evaluation criteria for the universities in the US to get research fundings from government. In India, only government authorized universities get these types of fundings like IITs and IIMs. Just to add to what Vishav asked, it's not completely correct, Vishav. In India, the private universities also we can get funding from the government. Yeah, but what are the
Yeah, this is a great question. So there's sort of different kinds of funding that exists in the U.S. So there's some funding that goes mostly to public universities, like government universities, that's directly for operating expenditures. That's typically coming from a state government. So like California, the state would provide money to the universities in California. And so that's one form of funding. That's typically like operating funding. It just provides part of the budget. But for research funding, it's usually a little different. Usually most research funding is coming from the federal government. So the government in Washington, D.C., and any university in the United States can apply for that. So it goes to private universities, it goes to public universities. It's typically on a project basis. So it would be something like a professor has an idea. They think, oh, you know what, I can make a really great discovery, and maybe what I discover could cure this kind of cancer. You know, that could be something that would be important. And they submit a proposal to Washington, D.C., basically saying, I have this idea. I think there's a lot of potential here that this new technology could be a cure for cancer. And what happens is it goes to Washington, and then what they do in Washington is the National Science Foundation, in this case, the National Institutes for Health, NIH, would evaluate that proposal. And what they do is they send it to peer reviewers. So what they would take that proposal that came in, they would send it to experts in that technology at other universities and say, what do you think? Do you think this is a promising research direction? Do you think this has any hope of success? Or do you think it's kind of pie in the sky and it's not going to work? And then what would happen is those reports, those reviews would come back to the Washington, D.C. office. They would look at the reports. They would have a lot of different proposals that would come in. They would fund the ones that are the best, where people say, oh yeah, this looks like very, very promising. The ones that are not promising, they would say, no, we're not going to put funding into it. So it's typically a competitive process where individual researchers are basically competing for grants, and the reviewers are trying to evaluate how likely it is to be a successful research project. Is it going to result in important discoveries or not? But the research process, I think in the United States and in Canada and many other countries, really tries to focus on scientific excellence and really tries to get away from being a political decision, where the funding decision is basically based on what's the promise of the project, how experienced is a researcher, how likely is it to be successful.
Thank you so much for answering that question. We have another question from Anurag Mishra, and Anurag has asked, there are many students who migrate from their home county to another place to study, and they settle there and work. What steps should be taken by the local government to reduce the brain drain?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things I think is really trying to get the knowledge out of the universities more. So I think you have to kind of work harder to get knowledge out of universities and basically have access to university knowledge, not only in that local community, but also in other places. So again, think about the United States example. They had this program in the early 1900s where they basically found this to be the case. In agriculture, they found that universities were generating a lot of discoveries in agriculture, but people weren't using them. They weren't being diffused broadly. Nobody was adopting them. And so they introduced this whole system called extension agents. They call it an extension program. And so every county in the United States, there's 3,000 of them, had an extension agent. That extension agent, their role was to be in their home county and also to go to the university. So they would basically go back and forth. They would go to the university and say, okay, what are you guys discovering? And then they go to their home county and talk to the farmers and say, okay, what do you need? And they basically be that kind of intermediary. Their job was to spread that information around. And from some of the work that I've done, others have done, I think that is an effective program. And so we could have something like that in the modern world today. If you think about digital technologies or new technologies that are being developed in universities in India, there should be a way to spread those to other locations that are not too far away. But I think, again, it depends on personal interaction. So it's not enough to just set up a website and say, oh, we're just going to put up a website. Anybody in India can go there and sort of find out this information. I think you need to have a person whose job it is to talk to the researchers at the university, talk to students at the university, learn the ideas that are happening, and then actually go into the communities, these other communities, and actually talk to people in those communities, hear their problems, hear their challenges, and see if there's solutions that are being developed at the universities that can fit them together. So I think it is really getting the knowledge to flow much more out of the universities.
Thank you, Professor. We have a rather long question from Anushya Badua. So what I'm going to do is, and I'm going to unmute Anushya. Anushya, I'm unmuting you. You can ask the question yourself to Professor.
Hi, sir. I guess it's good afternoon there. Good morning. So, sir, actually, I stay in Guwahati. It's like a small town in India. So, we have an Indian IIT here. It's just an half an hour away from the town. So, the area surrounding is like mostly village areas. So, it has not developed as much. There's only some eateries and grocery stores, but I was in Calcutta during my undergraduate years, so I had seen like within a time period of like the 4 to 3 years, the area just it's called New Town there, so it had rapidly changed because a lot of the IT sectors and we have special economic zones, and it has developed completely because even that was an village area type, but it has completely transformed. Like it's actually really shocking. So I do you think that these things happen because like at the end of the day these IIT people or some of the like whoever like are the graduates, they go to another city, like a bigger city. Like Guwahati is a small town, we don't have much job opportunities as much as we can have in Calcutta or Bombay or Delhi. So do you think this happens because we don't have these work opportunities in these small towns, and that's why there are these small like towns like Guwahati are not developing as much as Calcutta? So that's my
Yeah,
question.
it's a great question. Yeah, no, there is a. I think there are a number of forces that are leading to bigger cities to attract more people and provide more jobs. And so the way we talk about economics is we call this agglomeration economies. And what we see in the data and what we observe is that being in a big city does create better job opportunities for you. So if you take the same person, you move to a big city, there is better job opportunities. Part of it is matching. So when a city is bigger, the labor market is bigger, and so you have a much easier time to find your ideal job. So for example, if you're looking for a very specific kind of software engineer with very specific skills, you need to go to Silicon Valley to find that person. If you're a company, if you're in a smaller city in Canada, you're not going to find that person. And so when all those companies move there, because there's a lot of workers with very specific skills, that also makes it even more attractive for those workers with very specific skills. That's one factor. We are also seeing that especially younger workers seem to have a larger preference for being in big cities. They really enjoy the city life more, and cities generally are cleaner and nicer than they used to be. Certainly in the United States and Canada, in the 1950s and 60s, cities were still quite polluted, and there's a lot of problems with crime and things like that in cities in that time period. Since that time period, since the year 2000, certainly onward, cities have become very clean, very safe kind of places. So a lot of the negative aspects of cities, city life have gone away. I think the downside for a lot of workers considering that is a lot of times the cost of living. It's very, very expensive to get an apartment or a flat in some of these large cities. So I think, yeah, it's definitely true. The big cities are becoming, generally more dominant. There has been potentially some change in that with COVID. Some people are looking to get away from big cities, to get away from crowded places. But I do think that large cities will be increasingly an important force in the economy around the world. So yeah, it is a challenge for smaller communities. I think smaller communities, the way to make progress probably is specialize more, try to find something where you have a real comparative advantage in, and really see if there's a way you can build that. Then focus more on quality of life. Certainly when people get a bit older and they have children, they want to have more space, they're concerned more about the cost of living and things like that, maybe more likely to move away from big cities. So thank you for the question.
Professor Whalley, I've been thinking about, as I was listening to you, and I was thinking that uh, in some parts of US, in New York or in Boston area or in parts of California, so there is a very high concentration of research universities, right? So do you think that there has been any differential what do I say impact on the regional economy? So when you come when you're comparing university or rather regions like New York, Boston, or San Francisco vis-a-vis some small town in Midwest with one or two research universities there, do you think that the impact has been drastically different, or what has been the
Yeah,
differential?
that's a great question. So I think one thing that's kind of unique about the United States is that universities really compete with each other. They're very competitive. And so a lot of times Harvard and MIT are comparing each other against each other, competing for resources. They're trying to look to do things in a better way. So I think if you have an environment where you have universities competing, it really does force the universities to try to perform at their best. Some other countries, especially European countries, sometimes they have like a very centralized system. They have just kind of one government university in a certain area that's not really competing with anybody. So in France, for example, they may be in Paris. Paris might have a large collection of universities, and they're all specialized in different areas. So I think the US is quite unique in terms of that competition. And then also there's a dynamic labor market. Like people do go from one university to another, and that's a really important way of spreading ideas. So when someone works at MIT for a while and then they go work at Harvard, they take the ideas with them. Or if somebody works at Stanford, they go to Berkeley, they take the ideas with them. So and then a lot of countries have very rigid hiring practices for academics. So Italy, for example, professors are civil servants. They have to go through the civil servant process. It's very, very hard to change universities. And we do see that that is one of the successes of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley doesn't enforce what are called no compete agreements. So no compete agreements are when you started a company, you sign an agreement saying, I won't go work at a competitor. I won't do that. California is one of the only states where they don't enforce that. So they have a very, very fluid labor market. People are always changing jobs. They're always going from one company to another. And so what they're doing is taking that knowledge with them across different companies. So I think there's definitely something to that. When you have a cluster of a number of research universities together that are all sort of competing and all sharing workers between them, it does share the knowledge more, and it does build up the total knowledge stock even more. And that's a great insight.
Thank you. Thanks so much for answering that question. I have one question from Akhil Haridas. Akhil has asked that, can the type of research promoted by the university can have an impact on the development of the local economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd say that we don't know the answer, but it's a great question. But I have talked to people before who have suggested that. So people in University of Chicago, for example, it's a world-class research university, and a lot of the university leadership are asking, how come we're not having tech spillovers? Why are we not? And part of the University of Chicago is engineering is not really their strength. They're not really focused on engineering. And so there's been a debate there is maybe the reasons we're not having such a big success is we don't do as much engineering. Stanford and MIT are very engineering focused universities. Yale and Chicago are not. So I think there's anecdotes that suggest like what the university does can matter, but I'm not sure there's really evidence that really pins that down at this stage.
Vavya has asked here that since India is a low middle income country and a major chunk of population cannot afford higher education, which is clearly more expensive, do you think for countries like India or other emerging countries or developing nations, vocational training programs and universities that provide vocational training programs rather than research universities, they can aid growth in especially in the less developed areas?
Yeah, it's another great question. So I think part of the success of other countries has been. I mean, Germany, for example, has a very established vocational training system. What I would say is I'm not sure that universities are the best ones to do it. So in Germany, it's much more an apprenticeship system. So it's much more that people are working in companies. They're working with companies in a junior role. And so for me, like a vocational training system potentially is more like learning on the job. It's not so much learning in the classroom. So you need to be working with people who are experts and really understand the job and really understand the occupation. And so there may be a role for expanding a program more in an apprenticeship way, but it's certainly true that it's not only research universities that matter. I mean, these levels of education really do matter at a lower level. I don't think we have as good evidence. I don't think we know as much about them, but it's certainly true they do matter.
Ashish here has asked a question. Ashish is one of our MBA students, and I understand that the question is very close to every MBA student who is attending this lecture. He has asked that, how can we bridge up the gap between the number of jobs available, and the number of graduate students. If setting up a university increases the job availability and growth, how do you have so much gap between graduate student and job availability?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one thing I would say is the things you're learning as an MBA student really matter. So what we're seeing now in economics is there's more and more research that management quality is super important for firm success. And we're seeing that these do have effects on firm success. So another study I thought about putting in here, which I did not put in, was there's a study looking at what happened in Italy after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, Italy was really struggling. Things were not going well. The United States had what's called the Marshall Plan. So it was a plan to kind of rebuild Europe. And one element of what they did in Italy is they came in and they looked at the performance of the companies there, and they looked at how well they were managed. They saw, you know what, they're not well managed at all. They're really not well managed. And so what they did is they took the Italian companies that were not well managed, and they matched them to US managers who were really experienced and knew how to manage companies very well. They basically trained them in manager practices. And what you see is the companies that did have this experience, this training, did very well. Their productivity went up really significantly, and so there is real gains from what you learn in management programs, and especially matching with different kinds of technology. And what you see coming out of these universities a lot of times is these very technically savvy individuals who know tech really well, but they have no idea what the business application is. They have no idea what the market of the technology is. They have no idea how to commercialize it. So I think it's like those skills fit together. And what I would say is, like, for a lot of students coming out, it's really like, if you can show you can create opportunities, that makes a big difference. If you can just really make things happen in your space. So it could be that, you start a club. It could be that you have your own startup company, and then people would really respect that. And you just show how you add value right from day one. I think that's the real thing I would focus on, is just focusing on how does your skills add value to an employer, and really try to demonstrate that. So kind of show it instead of telling it. If you just show them your resume and say, oh, I could be great, wouldn't this be amazing? It's like, no, show that I actually did this project. I worked with this startup. I talked to these tech, the tech students in this other area in mechanical engineering, and I helped them develop a business plan or something like that. And then the company was able to make some progress or something like that. I think that would be one advice that I would have, is really focus on your value add, how you add value to an employer, and try to demonstrate that as much as possible. Because I think you do learn a lot out of an MBA program, and sometimes the skills are not so tangible. It's not that easy to communicate them, but if you can use them in a way where you show the outcomes they create, then I think employers can right away see how you can really help them.
Yeah, completely agree with you. We have another question from another MBA student, Sai, and Sai has asked, at the time of slowdown, what kind of best plans would universities take to support their graduate students? Now, this is a very interesting question, because we are seeing what is happening after the COVID crisis. We have seen the lots of universities, they are running into problems and a financial problem in the US, in the UK, in Australia, all over the world. So during times of crisis like this, what should be the goal of the university to support the graduate students, and of course the local community and the region they are based in?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's very timely. Yeah, I think the thing is, like, showing how the things you've learned or the things you have, show they add value for the current crisis. So, for example, there may be some new technologies, new ideas that could help address COVID issues. But from an MBA student perspective, if you could help those tech students show how what they're doing can really solve the crisis, how do they make a business around it? How could they help? How could they build a startup that may actually have an impact? I think people are looking to universities to be a positive story and to really provide new ideas, and I think that's what we do provide. We have a lot of great students who have all kinds of different ways of thinking about things. We have faculty who are looking constantly for new ideas. So I think society looks to us in the academic sector for new ideas, and I think not every new idea has to work, and not every new idea is going to be successful, but we want to just kind of bring in different ideas to try out. We want to kind of experiment. Oh, what about this? What about that? What about this? And I think, if you bring in new ideas where you're really trying to make an impact, I think there'll be a very positive reception. And I do think that, governments and other supporters of universities, they'll support universities when they provide value. So I think the key thing is we have to show how the university provides value. And I think a lot of people off campus would see that in terms of job creation, in terms of new startups, in terms of new solutions to problems. So we have a lot of curiosity-based kind of basic research. We're interested in this or interested in that. But if we can translate that into an actual solution where it's like, you can use these ideas we've learned about in our classes or in our research, and we can apply them to try to solve the solution. And I think trying to experiment with those ideas and not having the pressure that every idea has to work out. It's really that you're trying to make an impact, you're trying to make a difference. And I think universities that do that try to focus on making impact off campus will do well. And going back to the United States example, there was a lot of skepticism early on about these universities doing agricultural research. A lot of the farmers were very much like, this is book farming. This is not going to have any effect on my farm. There's just kind of these scientists playing around with different things in their labs. It doesn't matter. But once they started getting the knowledge out of the universities, and once farmers saw in their fields that their crops were more productive, their farms were making more money, then their support really kicked in. So I think when universities can show that impact outside of their campus walls, the public will get behind it.
So we have a quick question from Anmol Sekawat here, and I'll like to expand on that question a little bit. We have suddenly, since last March or April, pretty much all the universities all over the world have gone online. And this is something that we never really had at the top of our mind even a year back. The classes are on Zoom or some other platform. So do you think that do you think, according to you, has this created, new opportunities, or has it hindered some of the progress that these research universities have been making already? Because I understand that if I mean from I mean if I'm to ask this question, then I would say that of course it has created a lot of opportunities. The classrooms are literally without boundary. Now we have you from another part of the world right now talking to my class, uh, but also I have seen my students talking about, and I've also read in different places where students say that they miss the physical interaction in the class, in the being inside a class, right? So not looking at a computer screen. So what do you think? What is the net impact of this e-learning? Is it here to stay? Is it creating more opportunities, or is it kind of pushing us a little back?
Yeah, great question. Very timely again. So my personal view is it has created a lot of opportunities. I think a lot of universities had made this transition on the fly. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a thought out strategy. It was just kind of real time trying to make it work. And I think that from most students' perspective that I've heard, they prefer the online, they prefer the in-person learning. They really do like having classes. Part of it is interacting with the professor, and part of it is interacting with each other. So they can learn from each other. They can ask questions more. It's just a more engaging environment. And from the work that I've done, others have done, I think in person, there's something about in-person interaction you can't replicate online. It's just not the same. And so I think what we're going to see is I think we will move back to more in-person instruction. I don't think this online remote learning is here to stay in a broad sense. I do think there is going to be more new models open up though, because some things can be delivered online, like some things that are very, very, you don't need much debate. There's not much real discussion. It's just kind of like working through different examples or something like that. I think there may be more hybrid learning available. So professors might teach a class, but also post a video and have both of those available. So students can watch the video and they can hear some of the information. And then after, you can have a class where you have a debate or you discuss, what are your questions, or what do you think about this, or what do you think about that? So I think it'll change the education model in that way. We'll see, I think, a more of a hybrid type approach. But I don't think the majority of students would want to do classes online. It's possible that it does open up a lower cost education option as well, though. So it could be that there's different levels of education. So we have like a much more affordable education that's primarily online. And a professor could have hundreds of thousands of students or thousands of students in their class. And then the students can complete that aspect, and that could be done quite cheaply. And then there could be a more advanced option, maybe a graduate option or MBA option that's taught in person. It's much more advanced, and so it needs to be in person. So I think that could be one thing there as well. So I think, yeah, there's challenges and opportunities, but I think on balance, I think that most students that I've talked to, my own personal view is that in-person interaction is definitely the way to go.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree with that. I can't agree with you more. When you said that, it will probably expand the reach more. We can teach like thousands of students in a classroom right now, so all of them are on Zoom, and of course, it will be much cheaper because if the students are not using the campus facility, So of course, and I think this exciting times ahead, and this is going to probably change the face of the education, for good and
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
permanently. Professor, do you have time for two more questions?
Sure, that would be great.
Cool. So I will take a question from Jasmine. Jasmine asks how the market size drive the localization of knowledge hubs in the US.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, access to markets is a really big part of economic geography. I'm not exactly sure how you think about market size. I mean, I guess like, the university system in the United States is very large, there's many universities. And because the market is bigger, there's can be more specialization. That's one thing we know is that as the market gets larger, there's more opportunities for specialization. And some universities are known for different things. So John Hopkins, for example, is known for its medical area. That's really where it's world class. Stanford is much more known for engineering. So there's kind of more and more specialization. So I think there are gains from specialization, becoming more and more specialized, focusing on what you do and what you're really, really good at. It does allow the university to perform at a higher level. So I think market size would be an important factor. I imagine the projections are for India to have a significantly larger market size than the United States down the road, based on the population as the fraction of people going to university increases over time. So perhaps India down the road might even have a larger market size.
Thanks. I'll take one last question, and the question is from Radhika Garg, and Radhika asks that mobility results into brain gain for one and brain drain for other. I think she means region indirectly. So how is this growth sustainable or justifiable? What I think she is trying to infer here, that is it some sort of a zero-sum game?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think that's a great question. One region gains, one region loses, but the reality is the region that gains, they benefit more than the region that loses. So on overall, we do actually see an increase in knowledge. And one of the most important factors driving economic growth is knowledge and innovation. So if by having people together clustered in Silicon Valley, the whole United States produces more innovations, that does increase growth than having all those people separated from each other, not talking to each other. It does have regional implications. And some economists say, we shouldn't really focus on which regions of the economy are poor, like which countries or which cities or locations. What we should focus instead is on people. We should focus on worrying about poor people, not poor places. And so maybe we should focus more of our attention less on where people live and more on how are they actually doing. And so there's a whole other branch that says we really shouldn't worry about which locations people are going to. We should just worry about how they're doing wherever they are. But it's a great question. But I think overall the brain gain is bigger than the brain drain, because the effect of getting all the people together generates even more innovations, more new ideas, more startups than having everybody kind of separated in different locations.
So economic surplus overall, it increases.
Yeah, the whole size of the economy would be bigger.
Okay, we still have more questions coming, but we are out of time, I guess. So we will stop. I'll stop taking any more question. But if you have any more question, I'm talking to the participants. If you have any more question, feel free to send them to me. I'll collect the questions. I'll share those with Professor Whalley, and he can answer those questions in his free times. So would that be okay, Professor Whalley, if I
that would be great. I'd love to hear those questions.
Okay, fantastic. I'll do that. So with that, it's on behalf of Jindal Global Business School and the Center for Research in Emerging Economies. We extend heartiest thanks to you for coming over here and deliver the lecture. I understand that it's pretty early in the morning for you, so thank you so much for coming and agreeing to do this lecture. This has been a fascinating lecture, and this is I've been telling my students for last quite a few days that you should attend this lecture because it is so relevant, and we are all living in this reality. It's not some abstract macroeconomic theoretical research. It's absolutely relevant, and everybody we are living this reality right now. So it's even relevant for us. I mean, you have mentioned the example of Jindal Global University, and we are in a rural area, and we are seeing that the area is developing thanks to the university. Lots of developments and real estates and other things coming up nearby. So it's fascinating, and your research is it's absolutely in line with what you're living right now. So thanks so much for coming, and thanks so much for delivering this lecture. And I also
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a delight to be here. It's fantastic to talk to you all, and I've loved learning a little bit more about the university. I'm very optimistic. I'm excited about new universities. I think what you're doing is great. I'm sure you're having a large impact on the community and the students and research in the area. And I really appreciate the chance to come and talk to you all. And I love the questions. So thank you so much for the questions, and thank you for the chance to be here.
thank you so much, Professor. Thanks so much. And I promise that when the situation becomes better, and when the pandemic is over, and when we can again go out and meet people, and we'll be more than happy to invite you over in our university and host you here, and probably can have face-to-face discussion with you about
That
our.
would be wonderful. So that would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for staying up late in the evening for talk about universities. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thanks so much. You have a great day.
Cheers. Thank you.